Well, on this barren and broken patch of concrete once stood the statue of Frederick Douglass, torn down, as Scott Ott has pointed out. We don't know who the perpetrators are yet, but given the mood in the country, I'm going to assume was torn down by the protesters who are trying to destroy every aspect of our history. And this particular statue, to me, is an indication, if you needed any other evidence, that this entire movement about white supremacy is a lie, because of all the people on the face of the earth who you should be worshiping if you do believe in these Black Lives Matter ideals. This is the guy. Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green and Scott Ott, and this is your right angle on the desecration of the statue of Frederick Douglass, which I think was in Rochester, New York. Now, as Scott pointed out on our Backstage show, we do not know who the perpetrators are. We know the statue was found on the other side of a fence. It had been beaten up, but basically leaning against the fence. Somebody just tore it down and chucked it over the side. But I'm going to go ahead and play my hunch that this was part of the ongoing effort to just pull down statues of anyone ever, anywhere. But what I'd like to do in this episode is twofold. Steve, I'd like to start with you. If woke standards could produce an unindictable source in history, then it would have to be Frederick Douglass. We're not talking about a white person who emancipated slaves. We're not talking about an Uncle Tom. We're not talking about any of that stuff. Frederick Douglass was born as a slave. He was taught how to read a little bit by the wife of his former master. He then went on to teach himself how to read. Once he had a foothold, he just did it in secret. He then went to the North, where he was basically the entire reason that the anti-slavery movement took effect. You can credit very, very largely to the work of guys like Garrison presenting Frederick Douglass to groups of white people and saying, here is an extremely articulate, well-spoken black man, and I'm not going to say another word, at which point Frederick Douglass would get up and speak for an hour or two. And everybody coming out of that room said, this is not a slave and this is not an animal. This is a man. This is a particularly bright and good man, and so on. He was absolutely instrumental in the end of slavery. He did it from the ground up. He didn't get any help at all. And so when you see that his statue has been torn down, you have to draw certain conclusions. One of them is either they're not serious about the goals of Black Lives Matter. It is all just about destroying stuff. You come to the conclusion that it's not about destroying dead white males, because the statue of Frederick Douglass, clearly a black man, and rather ferocious looking too, I might add. So there's not a whole lot of, toadying going on there. And finally, Steve, you can say to yourself, well, they're just too stupid to know who it is, which I think is the likely case. But if that's the case, then you're not about a philosophical movement, and these are not legitimate protests. This is just banging things up.
It is a philosophical movement, but I'll get to that in a second. First, I want to talk about Frederick Douglass in sort of a roundabout way. France has its national emblem in the figure of Marianne, who is every generation they choose some beautiful actress or famous French woman to pose for the sculpture and all of this for their national symbol. If we were to have one other than Uncle Sam, it should be Frederick Douglass. Uncle Sam is kind of fun in for wartime stuff. He's this stern, muscular guy who's always doing stuff and taking action. But for a day-to-day symbol of the spirit of this country, you can't do better than Frederick Douglass. He represents the two halves of our history. He comes from the dark half when a third of this country embraced slavery and helped to create, as you just said, our second half, in which we struggle, and we still struggle, to increase that liberty to every American. What he did and what he represents is absolutely the very best this country has to offer. And that's exactly why they have to tear him down along with everything else, Bill. If you were to choose a word to represent the various segments of this progressive movement, if you want to call it that, engulfing the country, whether it's Antifa or Black Lives Matter, and I mean the Marxist organization Black Lives Matter, not the noble and necessary sentiment that Black lives do indeed matter. If you need an umbrella term to cover all of these various groups, it would be Jacobins. It's exactly the right word for these people. And if you don't know, I'm talking to our viewers now, I know Bill and Scott know, if you don't know your French Revolutionary history, the Jacobins were the one who needed to tear down every single bit of French society and French history in order to begin again at year zero. So they did. They tore everything down. And the next step, of course, is you have to eliminate the wrong thinkers, the bad people. And that brought us the guillotine. So brought France the guillotine. So this is a philosophical movement. It's a very old and wicked philosophical movement. But don't mistake their goals. It's year zero in the guillotine.
That's well said, Steve. Scott, the achievements of Frederick Douglass are astonishing. The statue, as I understand it, stood on one of the locations of the Underground Railroad, which throughout my entire youth I was convinced was an actual railroad that ran underground from the south to the north, but was essentially the escape route for slaves fleeing slavery, a series of safe houses and trails and guides and so on. And that was where this statue stood when it was ripped down. It's easy to look at what Frederick Douglass accomplished in terms of his political outcome. He was probably the most influential individual in freeing the slaves in the United States, and I include Abraham Lincoln in that, who referred to him, by the way, at a crowded reception at the White House. Abraham Lincoln cut through the crowd and said, "My friend, Mr. Douglass," and went right across the room to find him and shook his hand the second he walked in. But the moral aspect of the man, just the moral understanding of him, puts these pygmies to shame. I'd like you to read just one quote from Frederick Douglass. This is a letter that he wrote to his former master. It was the wife of his former master who began teaching him how to read. I think his former master didn't like this idea too much. So many, many years later, Frederick Douglass wrote a letter to the man who used to own him. And this is what he said. "Your wickedness and cruelty committed in this respect on your fellow creatures are greater than all the stripes you have laid upon my back or theirs. It is an outrage upon the soul, a war upon the immortal spirit, and one for which you must give account at the bar of our common Father and Creator." There's more morality, philosophy, goodness, effort, integrity in that one paragraph of two sentences than I see in the entire modern day movement.
If you want to start a movement that's going to change America, my friends, and now I'm talking to the people who are out in the streets and protesting and upset at the racial injustice, and I share your outrage at the racial injustice and the police brutality incidents. But if you want to really start a movement that's going to change America, why don't you save the time that you're using to go around and deface and tear down statues and start building statues of men like Frederick Douglass? Why don't you start a GoFundMe campaign for that? Why don't you start erecting 2 statues of Frederick Douglass for every one that you've already torn down and stop tearing down the other ones? Why don't you put a little plaque at the base of the Christopher Columbus statue that says, while Columbus did discover the New World and had many accomplishments for which he might be admired, he also had this weakness. While so-and-so, and just put some historical context in it. Nobody would be outraged at that. Nobody's going to tear down your plaque. I've gone to museums where the docent gave that historical context of saying, while so-and-so was a terrific man and had these great accomplishments, he also did some bad things. Guess what? So do you. So did I. We are made of flesh. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And that phrase that Frederick Douglass used in talking to his old master and saying that your creator, your father and mine, basically, putting himself together with his former master and saying we both stand before a holy God. That's powerful stuff. And that's a message that can change hearts. That's a message that can pull people together. That's a message that can say, look, we have all fallen. We have all done stupid things. We have all been part of humanity's long trail of blood and deprivation and oppression. But that's not all that we are. And that's not all that we need to be. And the only way we're going to overcome this is if we can find ways to pay tribute to the kinds of people like Frederick Douglass and frankly like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln and a bunch of others whose statues are being defaced, to say This is what we're about. This is the new America. Not an America that tears things down, but an America that builds things up. Not a place where we have to scrub our history, but a place where we dip into our history to find examples of excellence worthy of admiration. It's, you know, the very characters and documents about which some of these protesters are outraged are the ones that Martin Luther King dipped into to write his fantastic speeches to call America. Not saying, hey, we want to tear down the stuff that was in the past. We made a promise in the past, and we're here to fulfill that promise. Let's fulfill that promise to Frederick Douglass. Let's build statues of him, and let's celebrate his values in our lives.
I'd like to address this, not that they're listening to the social justice warriors out there who are big on tearing down all these statues and so on. I find it interesting that all of you, black or white, born into a life of luxury and if you're in your 20s or 30s into one of the most race-blind, color-blind societies on the planet, are filled with outrage about slavery, while on the other hand, a man who was actually a slave, who grew up a slave, who was owned by somebody else, is so far above you morally and is so far beyond you in terms of understanding that you don't have to end up where you start from, that he simply puts you to shame, and you should be ashamed of yourselves. He would be ashamed of you. After all the fighting that Frederick Douglass did for black freedom and black equality in this country, he would be ashamed of what he sees today. He really would be. Now, I suppose it doesn't hurt for me to throw in a little quote of Frederick Douglass, another quote of his. And by the way, when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Frederick Douglass says, well, you can say a lot of things about Abraham Lincoln, but you can't say he's not a man of his word. Here's what Frederick Douglass had to say about Abraham Lincoln's party. I am a Republican, a black, dyed-in-the-wool Republican, and I never intend to belong to any other party than the party of freedom and progress. So maybe everything you believe in is wrong, but I'll leave you with a final thought. For those of you who say that white people cannot understand the black experience, for those of you who say, no, it's pointless to talk to white people, you simply don't get it. You are incapable, because of your skin color, incapable of understanding this. I will read you another quote that I like very much that I keep with me on my phone. This one isn't from Frederick Douglass. This one is from another successor to Frederick Douglass, another great champion of black rights named W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, he got into an ongoing debate that went on for years with Booker T. Washington, and I take Booker T. Washington's side on this. I think he was right about self-sufficiency. W.E.B. Du Bois said that white society should basically give the resources to W.E.B. Du Bois and their talented tenth, and they would distribute it to the black community. But in any event, he was without question one of the great champions of black freedom in this country in the days following the Civil War and emancipation. And this is what W.E.B. Du Bois had to say about the idea that you can't possibly understand this because your skin is different than mine. Du Bois said this, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. Across the color line, I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From out the caves of the evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of the stars, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius, and they come graciously with no scorn or condescension. So, wed with the truth, I dwell above the veil. I summon Shakespeare and he winces not. Since you had public school education, let me explain that to you. W.E.B. Du Bois, a great champion of black rights, is basically saying, I am calling on William Shakespeare. I connect to William Shakespeare. In the afterlife, I walk up to William Shakespeare and tell him that he is a great, great writer. And he winces not. He doesn't recoil from me because I'm black. W.E.B. Du Bois says, I summon. He doesn't say I ask for, I beg for. He says, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius, and they come graciously and smiling to me because we're all human beings and we're all part of the same family and the same background. I summon them. This wisdom is not white wisdom or black wisdom, belongs to the human race. And every single year, the further away we get from slavery in this country, at least in the last 20 or 30 years, the more ashamed the actual people who suffered the kind of things that you pretend to suffer the more they become embarrassed and ashamed of what you have become and what you've done with their legacy. There's another statue that's going to be removed. Steve talked about it a couple of weeks ago. It's a statue of Abraham Lincoln and a recently freed black, and people say, well, it's derogatory. He's on his knees. Lincoln has his hand over his head. Lincoln does not have his hand over his head. Lincoln has his hand out. The slave's eyes are not looking at Lincoln in gratitude. They're looking forward to the future. He is in the process of standing up. But that statue is going to be taken down because of you social justice warriors. And I want you to just think about this just for 1 second. The original of that statue was funded by slaves. These are slaves that took all of their disposable income, just got lots and lots and lots of money just to trash around when you're a slave. Former slaves took the meager poverty that they had and gathered it together to make a statue of gratitude, not only for this man, but for the fact that this man on the ground is getting up. You insult those people. You disrespect them. You absolutely tarnish their memories and everything they went through. And it is a form of stolen valor for a 20-year-old today to claim that he's suffering from the effects of slavery when the actual slaves who actually went through these horrors and hardships are far, far more forgiving, far more morally advanced than you are or ever will be. That statue needs to go back and it needs to stay there. And it needs to be built bigger, and we need to build more of them, as Scott said. And if you don't learn your own history, then we're going to have to teach it to you. But to say that this is about racism or white supremacy, when you tear down the statue of Frederick Douglass, you have proven that your entire movement is a lie. So there you go. For Steve Green and Scott Ott, I'm Bill Whittle. This is Right Angle. We'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us.